take a moment to welcome and thank you for joining us as we return with our Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I am Dr. Stephanie Page, the Community Engagement Manager for the ARC Network. This portion of our series will be featured on the second cohort of our Virtual Visiting Scholars program. This program empowers scholars to complete meta-syntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature on intersectional gender equity in STEM. Before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know, as I mentioned, that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website. As I said, live captioning is available for today's webinar, and I would like to thank Carla Ray, who is working with Interpreter Now, for providing today's live captioning. If you are interested in their services, please visit interpreter-now.com. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, I'd like to point out a couple of useful features for the app. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. Toward the end of today's webinar, we will share links in the chat to the feedback survey and resources related to today's conversation. If you have questions for the speaker, please add them to the Q&A. You can also upvote questions. We will have about 10 minutes for the speaker to answer questions for attendees. Next, I want to share just a bit about who we are as the ARC Network. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folk experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance Program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. As many of you may know, the ARC Network transitioned to WEPAN in February of this year, and we are thrilled for what's to come. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. I will now pass the mic on to the PI of the ARC Network, Dr. Heather Metcalf, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is a longtime mentor of mine, so it's a special honor to be able to introduce her to you today. Dr. Beth Mitchneck is Professor Emerita in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. She is currently leading a National Science Foundation project to develop metrics to assess institutional transformation at Hispanic-Serving Institutions. In addition, she is a higher education consultant specializing in faculty affairs and equity in STEM, and works with numerous universities to promote equitable evaluation processes. She has held numerous administrative positions at the University of Arizona and most recently Vice Provost for Faculty Success at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. She also was the lead program officer for the National Science Foundation's Advance Program to promote gender equity in academic STEM. Dr. Mitchneck has a dual research focus on migration and displaced populations with an emphasis on Georgia and Ukraine, and on gender equity in STEM. She has served on national boards for the Social Science Research Council, the Kennan Institute, and editorial boards for the Annals of the Association of American Geographers and Soviet Geography. Her most recent publications include A Recipe for Change, Creating a More Inclusive Academy in Science, and Displacing Blame, Divergent Accounts of the Georgia-Abkhazia Conflict in Ethnopolitics. Supported by the Op-Ed Project in 2015 to 2016, she has also published articles in the popular press in venues such as Foreign Affairs Online, The Hill, and U.S. News and World Report. Dr. Mitchneck, who also serves on the ARC Network Research Board, joins us today to share her work as a 2019-2020 virtual visiting scholar with the ARC Network, where she completed a meta-synthesis of the research on how social practices influence citation indices, commonly used metrics to evaluate the quality of scholarly productivity. I now pass it over to Beth Mitchneck to share her presentation with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you to the network as well for really giving me the time and the space to work on a project that is so important to me, and I think to all of us in the field in academia. So just to start with, let's get the slideshow going. Okay. So there's really three parts to my talk today. I'm going to talk about the meaning and the significance of the project that I've been doing, and then talk about the findings. So what have we learned about citation practice and citation indices? And then finally, to talk about what we can do about this. And I'll be giving some hints throughout the conversation today, but specifically, how do we decenter the dominance of the citation as the main indicator of scholarly success? It's shorthand, people use it, lots of people use it. And to really try to answer the question, can we use citation analysis in an equitable world for faculty, in particular STEM faculty? My quick answer to that question is, it depends. And I see the world in a lot of shades of gray. These are the three goals of my project. And the final report is really all about goal one, what did I do? And goal two, to communicate broadly. I try to talk about citation indices and citation practice to just about anyone who will listen. And the third goal is really, really key, to try and make institutional change happen, to create alternative measures of success that are potentially more equitable. So let's get started with some meanings. What do I mean when I talk about citation practice? Citation practice is a normative concept, and it means that really, two views. One is that it's a normative concept, and rational actors, sorry, I have something caught in my throat. Rational actors decide what research is the most influential, who are the most influential scientists, and really this comes from the world of a meritocracy. And then there's a second view, second approach, social construction, that sees the citation practice and the citation indices as an outcome of human-based activity, so human choices. And we all make choices as people to determine what we're going to cite and who we're going to cite. And this is a little graphic that I really like that breaks down the citation process, the practice, into certain discrete fields. So there's the selection of the citation. So who are you going to cite? And this demonstrates that there are really a whole host of factors that we use in our filters when we decide what to cite. And those are from the document itself, it's about the author, it's about the journal, it's about what's in the document. So the first point that I want to make is citation practice is really multifaceted. And there are two approaches, but there's a lot that goes into our own decision-making processes when we decide whether or not we're going to cite something. So this is an image from Twitter that came out about a month ago. Someone sent it to me and said, look, here are the top 1,000 scientists that work on climate. And what where did this come from, right? They say, the list says it's the most influential climate research. So I looked and saw how they actually put together the data. And what they did was they did a citation analysis. They looked at, the authors of this looked at how many papers scientists wrote on climate change and how often those papers were cited by scientists in that field of study, in an interdisciplinary field. And they looked at this up until December 20th. And it's really the number of cites weighted by the average number of citations that any publication in climate science might have received that year. And then they added in the Altmetrics, which is a measure of attention. And I want to note that the scientists actually, the people who put together this, this index said that it may be skewed because of Altmetrics. And we'll talk about Altmetrics in a moment. But I want to present to you a few of the comments below this initial Twitter feed. The first comment says, it's a measure of influence. Another comment, this list has an unconscious bias against women climate scientists. I hope you all see where we're going right now. The next one, cool, found my name and that of many friends and colleagues. Thank you. And then a really simple comment, just no. Now, I could ask you all to guess to see which side of the screen came from male scientists' comments and which side of the screen the comments came from women scientists. But I think that's pretty self-evident here. And for me, this screen really demonstrates a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. That yes, it's a measure of influence. That's the normative model. And yes, in the literature, we found a lot of evidence to say that this is unconscious bias against women climate scientists. And in fact, of the top 100 scientists, only 8 are women. Now, maybe some of you are in climate science, so you know that many of the top climate scientists are in fact women. And in the list, it only notes 7 as being women because they got the gender wrong of 1%. And in the top 30, there's only 1. Now, that's really not so likely to occur in today's world up to 2020. So where does all this come from? And why do I think that these comments on Twitter are just exactly what I found in the literature? Let me go forward and talk about that in terms of the key terms. Citation analysis. This is an image of an H factor, that we think of this as objective measures of merit or influence. And we're measuring, this is very simple to measure, right? We've got the who, we've got the document, we've got the journals. And so we're just calculating a very simple algorithm. And that's one of the advantages of this, that it's very simple. And it's really a simple count. You've got citations, the number of citations, the H index where it's weighted by the number of papers that somebody has written, or the other index below the H index tells us in the last 10 years. So you can weight this in various ways and come up with different findings. And it's very appealing because it's simple. And because it's so simple, we in the academy, and as that Reuters Twitter shows, people outside of the academy as well are using this measure. And it's a very commonly used measure of productivity of individuals. We compare people. And I would say by the end of today's talk, you would realize like that's a no-no, don't compare people because they're just not comparable. We look at this and we use this as a measure of research networks, how extensive research networks are, and we relate this to the status of a journal as well. So there's a lot of uses for these metrics in our everyday lives. Now, Altmetrics, I mentioned they were using, but the Reuters folks use that as part of their algorithm. And I like to think of this as a 21st century citation analysis because citation indices generally will look at academic literature. But we know as scholars in 2020 or 2021 that we're sharing our research across social media, There are so many more outlets. So I like to use the Altmetric in addition to other measures. And this gives a sense of the attention, how many Facebooks, blog posts. So it's another measure of impact. And it brings us up to really the current period of time, because it's so important for us to situate ourselves as scientists in the century in which we're located, that we no longer just write our research up and put it into a peer-reviewed journal. There's a lot of different ways that we can do this. I think it's also really important to note a different kind of citation analysis that is being done also in the 21st century. And I like to call those the semantic and syntactic studies. And I think of these as falling into the social constructivist perspective, because we're analyzing the text as a document that shows how we used it. So it's the outcome of the human choices that we've made, the motivations. Semantically, did we use this citation in a positive way, in a negative way, or was it totally neutral? And we're all familiar with those literature review sentences that have 10 citations at the end. And they might as well, I don't want to say not have been written, but there's no value statement there. It's just saying this was written, and that's a neutral. The syntactic approach will also look at where in the document the piece was cited, and that can tell you a lot as well. Is it in the introduction? Is it in the analysis? Is it in the implication section? And so combined, the tone that's used when we're talking about the citation and the location tells us a lot more about the meaning of that specific citation. So not all citations are going to signify a high impact. They will signify other things as well, some of which we can figure out by looking at where it is syntactically and the semantics. This can be done computationally, or you can do it manually. And I've done this manually. And if you use it computationally, it's called the content-based citation analysis. And this was one of my favorite papers, Ding et al. And this paper starts out by saying, look, there's value to a citation, but the quality of the work that's being cited is only one criteria that goes into how we decide what gets cited and where it gets cited. And so if we want to think about it from that perspective, citations, sure, they can signify high impact, but they don't all signify high impact. They signify a whole bunch of other things. So how many of us read the research, conduct our work in a vacuum almost? I won't even say colorblind, but these images, we don't even know who is writing this paper. And that's not usually accurate. We do usually know who's writing that. And so all of our filters come into play. So what has some of the research said about this? That we really do know the people that we cite, that we tend to know 3/4 of the people that we cite, they're in our networks. And so I'll talk about how citation is really network dependent. We also know from a plethora of studies that citation practice varies by characteristics, by a number of characteristics. And in the final report, you'll see there's a lot of citing to the different clusters of research, but there are a lot of studies that assess the person who's doing the research and the person who's being cited. And we found that these can vary, the number of citations can vary, and how you cite depending upon your rank, your discipline. Are you in a really big discipline? I'm not. I'm in I do geography, and I study people who are displaced in a particular part of the world. So every time I add an adjective, my world gets smaller. We also find that there's a strong influence of the institution that you work at or where the person you're citing works. Gender, there's a lot of studies around that. Reputation, race, fewer, nationality, network centrality, all of these different factors all feed into how we, you and I, make decisions about who we cite and where we cite. There's also significant variation over the type of research that's being conducted and how that research is cited. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as I mentioned, if you've got a really big discipline, then you've got more options of people to cite you, or the subdiscipline. Are citations different for interdisciplinary research or collaborative research? Absolutely. So really the main point here is to remember that this is a very complex process to understand, and that there's a lot of nuance here as well. I do want to say at the outset that the intersectional research is not as prevalent as looking at just gender or just race. And then I had to do a lot of inference and combining what we do know from research and seeing how that might play out in an intersectional way. So let's ask the first question. Do gender biases exist in the way that scientists practice citation? Yes, of course it does. And that was easy to find, although, I joke about it, but this is really a very significant scholarly debate, and there's been a lot of research on both sides. But I'm going to talk about three here that really show the span of how we found that gender biases are existent in the way that we practice, so practice citation, and then in the citation indices. So this first study is found across time and disciplines, just looked very generally across science, that papers published with a woman as the first author have fewer citations than those who are published with a man as the first author. Now, this gets a little bit more complex, because we know that the last author position can also be a power position. Before we even get to that, we know from another big data study that was done that papers with mixed gender co-authors are cited less than if the paper is only male. So in other words, papers that are all co-authors, male co-authors, tend to get cited more than papers that have mixed gender or are all women. And then the final point to remember, and there's been a substantial amount of research on this, that we tend to cite people who are close to us in our research networks, in our research labs, who are friends of friends. And so in these senses, yeah, these biases are evident in the outcomes. And then there's the whole side of the question that says, no, there's no gender biases. And it's not just those people that take the perspective that it's a meritorious academy. So what do people do? What are some of the papers, what do they look like that come down and say, no, there's no gender differences, there's no gender biases? These tend to be more recent studies. One recent study of social sciences classified, and this is a key piece, classified papers as being female or male-led. Now remember, on the other side of the slide, we know that all male papers are cited more frequently than mixed gender. So right away, there's a bias in the underlying data that these folks are using, but they do find that there's really no difference. Another very recent study, also coming out of social and behavioral sciences, looked at only the top 10% of the cited papers. So of all the papers that were cited the most anyway, is there any gender difference? And that study by Nielsen found that no, there wasn't. And part of my concern that I'd like to point out with these two papers is that they've already pared down the papers that they're looking at to see if they can find any gender biases. So they've narrowed the field to flagship or to the most cited. So those are really asking different questions, different fundamental research questions than in science does this happen. So we have different questions. Then intersectionality, citation rates, and type of research. We could find, this is a much broader literature than we think. So how many of us do collaborative research? How many of us by our own institutions are really encouraged to do collaborative research? And how many of us know how to really assign value? to who's doing what in a collaborative publication. It's hard. But one thing that we do know is that collaborative research tends to get more citations than single authored papers. The minus is that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the authorship and co-authorship order really, really matter. What we found first, as I mentioned before, that papers with women as the first author are cited less than if man was the first author. We also know from an intersectional study, not that many, but this is a really interesting one, Marshke et al. 2018, that in biomedical research, they looked at people's career length from 46 to 2014 to assess where in the career stage people were being cited the most, and did gender, race, and ethnicity show up as having any difference here. Well, predictably, what we found in non-Hispanic white, that's the technical census term, had the quickest movement from first author to the last author position and the most citations. The biggest gender gap by race was between white men and white women. And white women tended to reach the last author position over a longer course than white men. And Black and Hispanic scientists also moved to that really key last author location more slowly. And there's a smaller gender gap between our men and women. And that is key because it shows that it's all of that race. And I know I'm going to fall over this, but it is gender. It's gender big time for white scientists. And then as we look at this more intersectionally, race may become more important than gender. What about interdisciplinary research? And how many of us do interdisciplinary research? I do interdisciplinary research. Most of our universities are encouraging our young faculty to do interdisciplinary research. That's where we're investing, and for lots of good reasons. But when we look at the citation process and interdisciplinary research, we find that interdisciplinary research is often, it often takes longer to get into the literature. So it starts to be cited after a few years, whereas disciplinary research may get cited right away. And one of the plus, though, is that interdisciplinary research tends to stay getting cited longer than disciplinary research. So it's longer to get noticed, but it may stick around a little longer. Okay, so what about those racial or ethnic biases and that practice of citation? So yes, we know this from our lived experiences. There's a lot of that. And inference, like on the slide I just showed you. There's also a study that shows that the co-authorship networks are segregated by ethnicity and nationality. So that goes back to our networks as well. And but we know that citation practice is often network dependent. And we also know from research on networks that when women and men of color are often left out of informal networks, which are just as important to this as informal networks. And then finally, we know that the peer review process can be both gendered and racialized. And we also know from the study that's cited here that the peer review process is more likely to have a negative effect on your rate of productivity for faculty of color, just getting those negative reviews. You know, if I got a negative review, it might take me a little bit longer than I'd like to recover and get back out there. But for many people in this very detailed qualitative research study, for many people getting those negative reviews could be a showstopper or very, very much slowing down the process. So what are some of the responses to this kind of exclusion? And I really want to bring in the word exclusion here because it's not scientific inclusion when you exclude a lot of scientists. So we have some social movements that have been responses to try to end the exclusion. And I would encourage you to take a look at some of these websites and then the hashtag as well. Okay, so paper that you mentioned, Recipe for Change. Here, how about if we do a recipe for high citation rates? So I was joking with a colleague recently, and I said, if you want to get a really highly cited paper, I'll tell you how to do it. So let's look for a dominant majority faculty. And then let's talk about those inferences for faculty from diverse backgrounds. So what do we know about that dominant majority faculty? If you want to get published, if you want to get cited a lot, collaborate, have a lot of collaborators, and publish with male authors. And in the ideal, those male authors may be first or last author. You want to have a big disciplinary field, you know, Soviet, post-Soviet geography, not a big disciplinary field. So not a lot of people out there that are going to cite. You want to publish in a flagship journal. It is an empirical reality that flagship journals tend to get more cited than journals that are not flagship. There's also research that shows that the bigger your bibliography and the number of your own references, the more cited you get. So have a big bibliography, have a big network, expand your network. All those networking opportunities that we're given, take them, because the more people we meet, the more people will be likely to cite our research. Join a citation club. And the citation I have here is a paper that goes through all the ways that you can game the citation indices, but citation clubs and citation coercion have been found to be very effective means of increasing your citation rates. Your research group, some people like a small, intimate research group. You want a big research group, because then you're going to get cited more by people in your own research group. And cite yourself early and often. And there's a paper that's, I think it was in Nature a couple of years ago, that basically ran the numbers on this and found that the most highly cited people were also the people that cited themselves the most. And finally, if you want to get cited a lot, publish in English. And there are a lot of implications about that as well. So most of our really highly cited research is in the English language. Okay, so let's see how this maps onto if you're not a majority faculty member. Publication networks tend to be homophilous. And what does that mean? That they're more homogeneous. So if you're going to have a smaller network, then you've got a smaller pool of people that are going to cite you. Women and other diverse scholars tend to be more interdisciplinary. And we know that interdisciplinary research takes a little longer, but stays longer in the cited literature. But also interdisciplinary fields tend to be smaller than larger disciplinary ones. We know from a lot of studies that peer review processes may be biased. I just saw one that came out recently about grant applications to the Swiss NSF, and they did their own analysis and found some significant bias in the way that people reviewed grant proposals. The networks, we keep coming back to networks. The research on academic networks shows that men tend to have larger networks, women tend to have smaller networks, women's networks tend to be more heterogeneous, and men's networks tend to be more homogeneous. That is a broad generalization because there's a lot better and more nuanced work, but that's the idea, that we don't have fully integrated networks. So we can join a citation club or a research group, right? Well, what's the alternative if you're from a diverse background? A social movement like Citassista. And there's a number of those, but that's a group response to what people have individually felt to be very challenging. Diverse faculty often are in smaller research groups that are in areas that are more on the edge, if you will, that could be more innovative. And we have men self-citing more than women. And yep, it's doable for diverse faculty to publish in English. So as you can see, it's not exactly analogous. This isn't a level playing field. And so bringing this all together, what do the citations really show us? They show us that certain people's voices are represented and included in intellectual conversations to a much greater degree than everyone else. And so the choices that we make, and I love this citation, the individual choices that I make about who I'm going to cite also means who's included in the conversation and who's excluded from the conversation. And if all of those inferences are right and we're excluding from the conversation, just really not willfully, but for not necessarily willfully, but for many other reasons, we're excluding from the conversation faculty members, scientists from diverse backgrounds. That's a problem for science. So what can we do about it? This slide is about things that you can do right away, that we can all do right away. We can stop talking about the citation as the measure of impact and influence in the academy. It is a measure of quality, and it's also a measure of a lot of other things. We can stop using shortcuts, and that goes back to the implicit bias literature. We use citation analysis as a shortcut measure of impact or reputation, like in that Reuters study, and 8 of the top 100 are women. We can also immediately have an honest conversation with ourselves. As we are reading, as we are citing, checking on ourselves, like we do when we're writing letters of reference, to make sure that we're not embedding racialized or gender terms and ideas into our letters of reference. Just do a little self-study. Check on your own citation practice so you can be part of the solution. And really, so that we can talk about citation as a summation of many different processes, and they're human processes. And as such, if it's a human process, it does go through our filters. Now, what can we do to create a real institutional change around citation process and transformation? That's the arrow that goes off. What can we do to disrupt this? How can we start doing things differently, which is really what we need to do to have a more equitable scientific experience, right? So we can change our promotion materials. And what I recommend is making our promotion materials more of what I would consider an equitable impact assessment or statement. So right away, I'd say, don't use things that we know are skewed, right? So at a minimum, what can we do for institutional change? We can revise policy documents at the department level, the college level, university level, at any level we want. We really can revise these policy documents, and we can require multiple sources of evidence. So if someone has an article that's been cited 3,000 times, that's not the beginning and the end of the story. We need to look at multiple sources of impact, not only different lenses, but from different angles. The second thing we can do right away is we can really refrain from using Google Scholar and H factor. And Hirsch has actually repudiated his own H factor. And we can look at a variety of factors and features of our research. The next level of change would be to really change the way that we're doing the review process, first the evaluation process, and use what I'm calling impact portfolios. When we go up for advancement or promotion, that we're using basically a portfolio or a dossier that documents the outputs of what we've done, much less so than impact. And many people will say, well, look, I'm looking at the impact factor of the journals that this person's published in, or look at how many citations, or the H factor of this person. That is, in fact, not a clear measure of the impact of someone's research. It's a measure of a lot of other things, as I've been talking about. We can also focus those impact portfolios on the impact and trajectory of our integrated scholarship. And what I mean is really counting what we do in teaching and in engagement, so that we're looking at our impact as the outcome of all parts of our job, not just one part of our job. And that next level of change that I really feel pretty strongly about again, is that multiple forms of evidence to help understand if we've achieved our scholarly goals and the desired impact. Like, did we do what we said we were going to do, but can we document what the impact was? And I would draw your attention again to the semantic and syntactic analysis of citations, the citation content analysis, because that gives us a lot of information. When I did this for myself manually, I was able to find the audience, the people reading were truly global. They were concentrated in Central Europe. That made a lot of sense, but the citations came from a lot of other countries, came from a lot of other disciplines. And these were all things that I was intending to happen. So it was great to find out that it did. So essentially, I'm advocating for changing our promotion materials to be much more focused on impact, but in an inclusive sense. And in order for us to understand what an inclusive impact is, it requires some structural change and institutional change. It requires new metrics like the content analysis, like a qualitative assessment, a deep dive into what happened as a result of my having published a certain paper or having written a policy document. What happened? The second area that I think is underutilized at this point is using the computational methods, the big data stuff, for us to get a really good sense very relatively quickly, because it takes a long time to do this by hand, but relatively quickly, like is our research being cited in parts of a paper that it's really important to be in, like the implications and analysis? Or are our papers being cited negatively? Gosh, I'd want to know that too. And so we can use the big data to find that out. And I think we also need to really think deeply about the audience for our research. Who are we doing our research for? Is it simply for however many people are going to read our flagship journals, or for the public, for publics? And so if we're thinking about the audiences in a really more complex way, then using something like an Altmetric can really help us understand the impact of the paper. So I can tell you for a fact that everything I've written about displacement and migrants in foreign affairs online has gotten way more exposure than the articles I've written for scholarly journals, which have also been impactful, but the scale is really quite different. And so at that point, I'd like to wrap it up, and here's some questions and comments from all of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Beth. This was such a great presentation. Thank you for sharing your work with us. We have a number of really excellent questions in the Q&A, so I'll pass those along to you one by one here. One question was asked by Jesse Smith and got upvoted a couple of times, wondering if something like Altmetrics is really any better than some of the traditional measures, especially because of what you mentioned about shares on social media and news stories and the like.
Yes, that's a great question. And I have to say that there are similarities, and your point is very well taken. The reason why I like to focus on using Altmetrics is that it expands the set of possibilities. So if I'm going to have more impact, then I want to know that the policymakers have been reading my work. So I know when I published in Foreign Affairs, there were policymakers in Washington that had read it by 7 o'clock in the morning on the day that it was published. And that was an audience that I wanted to target. This was about Ukraine. And so if we combine looking at those scholarly references with those references and that attention that it gets from, it could be policymakers, it could be legislators, it could be my neighbors down the street, I'd say that gives us a lot more information about the impact. Yes, it does. And there are some of those same critiques that you can levy against the Altmetrics that you can against the citation indices for scholarly journals. So yeah, it's with care.
Thank you, Beth. Another question from Joya Misra that also got upvoted a bunch was, can you tell us a little bit more about what an impact portfolio looks like and how do we do this in practice?
Oh, great question. Thank you. I'm so excited. And I won't say that I have this all worked out. I think this is something that we need to do as a community. But an impact portfolio is really looking at what's the mission of the institution. So we're all at different kinds of institutions, and hopefully the impact of the work that we do with students, as well as with research, will align with the mission of our institutions. We also hope that the impact of our research will have its desired effect. So as I mentioned about my own research, is about changing labor market forces when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia became a market economy. What was the impact? How did that change the economy? And the fact that with those two papers, I wanted to reach policy folks, I wanted to reach economists and government officials in the part of the world that I intended to have an impact on. Doing an impact analysis allowed me to see, yeah, this was being read, this was being talked about in even analogous situations where the labor market was undergoing through really significant transitions in Greece at that time. And so people saw an analogy there. So by impact portfolio, I want to know what the institution wants from its faculty members, and that should be clearly defined in the mission. What I'm trying to accomplish in my own research, so that would be clearly said in the statement, clearly written in the statement. And again, that integration of my research, my scholarship, my instruction, and my engagement with the profession and the world around. So it's really a focus on what happened as a result of the totality of my work, not just my research, but how it all fits together, and focusing on forms of evidence that really do explain what happened as a result of the work that I did, not just how many papers I published, how many students I graduated, how many students were in my class. So I hope that helps, Joya.
Thank you, Beth. Another question gets to the methodology of some of the papers that you've reviewed as part of your virtual visiting scholar work. So how do people really know the gender of an author of a paper? Is it based on the stereotypicality of the name? And a bit of a conversation happening around this question about how it'll be important to start tracking non-binary author citations as well, and trying to incorporate self-identification of gender and other social identities of authorship.
I'm so glad there was a lot of conversation about this because it's huge. And I brought this up as well when I mentioned that Reuters article that misidentified a woman as a man. So according to their analysis, there are really only 7 women in the top 100, but there really are 8 because they got it wrong. So the methodology that is used is generally of 2 types. One is that people actually look it up. And that's when you want to have a really fantastic set of research assistants and collaborators. And we know it is hard. And we know that a lot of disciplines have moved towards just using the first initial. And that can make things more complicated. We also know that many of these papers have used an algorithm, and I'm blanking on what it's called right now, but it's a gender algorithm that converts the name into what the likely gender is. And yes, there very well could be mistakes there. So I think we should consider that. And I would hesitate to call all of these data dodgy data, but the data can be fairly dodgy. And so we have to be careful about the conclusions that we draw from that and where we go from there.
Thank you, Beth. Another question from Nikki Thomas is, if we open up evaluation processes to multiple ways of measuring impact, how do we keep the open-endedness of that from making room for additional bias to come in?
Excellent question. I'm one of these people, and for those of you that know me know that I like to collaborate. I like for people to have input. And so what I advise departments or institutions to do is to norm it themselemselves, so that by department or sub area within a department, you're doing things in a similar way. So not that you can do anything, that anything goes, but to make it an equitable process, we want to make sure that everyone, I'm going to be careful about this, that there is general agreement about what goes into that equitable process evaluation. So it's not that the dossiers are all going to be done in 25 different ways, but that there's a set of measures that we can choose from that may be more or less appropriate to the kind of scholarship that we do. So I'm not talking about anything, but I'm talking about using methods that we know result in really good evidence. And I'm going to qualify that because nothing's going to be perfect, but that's why we want to use multiple measures of impact.
Thank you for clarifying that. A really easy question. Are you willing to share your slides with attendees?
Not really, but this is going to be recorded, so my slides will be out there on the recording.
All right, great, thank you. Another question is the connection with bias in the review process, what do you think about dual anonymous review? Asked by Nancy Morrison.
Yeah, well, that's better. Definitely better. Whatever we can do to get this more anonymous. But as we all remember from the work that was done to diversify orchestras, even when people were blind, you couldn't see, there were hints. So I don't think anything is going to be foolproof, but as much anonymity as we can have will help. But there are those other features that I mentioned, like size of a discipline, or that could really be impacted. If a discipline is small, we know who are the players there. We also know, and I'll be honest about this too, when a journal requests that you not self-cite, because then someone may know who the person is, it's often hard not to self-cite if you're in a small field. So I think it won't be foolproof, but it's better than having everyone know.
Thank you, Beth. Sonia Smith says, great talk, Beth. Do you have examples of or plans for institutions or evaluation committees for piloting this approach? We really need this.
Well, thank you, Sonia, and I'd be happy to talk with you offline so that your institution can pilot this. And I'm serious about that. I would love to do that. And I am concurrently working with 3 or 4 institutions around these specific issues and seeing what they'll adopt and what they won't. It's hard, change is hard. And this is a good time for us to begin that process.
Great, thank you. And I'll mention that Cynthia Warner shared that at Texas A&M Advance is piloting a workshop for more equitable promotion and tenure reviews. So folks can keep an eye out on the work that they're doing too. We are about out of time and we have more questions that are still coming in by the moment. So I'll make sure that I share these questions with you and perhaps we can get some answers to share back with the larger group. I want to also leave some time for Stephanie to be able to wrap us up here today and just give you another thanks for your excellent talk today and sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you. And for everyone who joined us, thank you so much for joining us. I've added a few links into the chat, including to Beth's report. I do want to share that we will continue this series with 2 more webinars centered on cohort 2. Next week on May 19th, Dr. Teresa Nelson will discuss her work on gender equity and academic entrepreneurship. And on June 24th, Dr. Allison Mateus will discuss her work on understandings of gender in STEM higher education research. And I've also dropped the links for those registration, the registration links in the chat too. Also on May 19th, we will be hosting a joint webinar with our home organization, WePan, entitled Intersectionality, International Faculty, and Inclusive Excellence. And this will feature presenters from Florida International University and their Advance Initiative. Again, that registration link is in the chat. We will also host, I'm excited to say, our second annual town hall on ensuring equity in institutional COVID-19 responses on June 3rd. And please keep an eye out. We will send more information on that when we send along the recording of this amazing presentation by Dr. Beth Mitchneck. And I just want to again say thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to return with our webinars and our this is our special time to engage with you and to have these critical discussions on intersectional gender equity in the STEM Academy. Thank you, Dr. Heather Metcalf, for co-hosting with me, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.